Fullmetal Alchemist is a manga about alchemy, and follows two brothers trying to get their bodies back after a failed attempt to bring back their dead mother. The main villains of the story are beings called the homunculi, who are artificial humans created through alchemy. There are 7 homunculi in total, with each being named after the 7 deadly sins: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. I am however only going to be focusing on 2 of the homunculi in this video: wrath and pride, the 2 strongest members of the 7, and, in my opinion, the 2 best villains in this series. While wrath and pride both fight against the main characters throughout the story, where they truly get to shine as villains is during Fullmetal Alchemist's endgame. In the climax of the story, most of the cast unites to stop Father, the creator of the homunculi, from sacrificing all the people of the country to create a massive philosopher's stone to turn himself into a god. At this point in the story, Father still has most of the homunculi, as well as a horde of mindless artificial soldiers that he uses to fight off all of the good guys. As the secret puppet ruler of the country, he is also able to deploy the entire military against the main characters. While this may sound like a lot, the good guys actually manage to deal with most of these obstacles. They successfully trick the military and infiltrate Father's palace, and Father's lesser servants also prove to be completely powerless against the good guys' strongest fighters. And, despite it taking some effort, the main characters even manage to take out a few of the homunculi at the beginning of the final battle. The climax of the story is actually pretty much a perfectly executed mission for the good guys, where everything works according to plan, and they take no casualties. Or at least it would have been perfect, if not for the presence of wrath and pride. These 2 are in a class of their own compared to Father's other minions. Despite the good guys pulling all the stops to beat them, wrath and pride keep coming back, and find ways to survive everything thrown at them. The 2 are essentially the reason why the ending of Fullmetal Alchemist has high stakes, and why the heroes actually came close to almost losing. Wrath and pride are far more powerful than the other homunculi, but what is very interesting is that they are not just strong, but also smart. Despite their superhuman abilities, the 2 have a lot of moments where they outmaneuver the good guys with just their intelligence. Another way to look at this is that they use absolutely everything in their power to challenge the main characters. Wrath and pride are not just passive boss fights the main characters have to complete. They are active players in the endgame of the story, where they are constantly on the move and taking part in the plot. While this may sound like nothing special, it is actually something very unique. Fullmetal Alchemist is ultimately a battle manga, where despite some differences, it is cut from the same cloth as series like Dragon Ball, Naruto, and One Piece. In battle manga, the standard for an antagonist is that they are a rather inactive figure in the story. The villain often has their one moment in the plot, where they wait for the good guys in one location, have their fight with them, get defeated, and the good guys then move on to the next obstacle. Fullmetal Alchemist itself is no stranger to using villains like this. During the manga's climax, the homunculus, Sloth, has very much this kind of a traditional role, where the good guys find him in the palace, have a fight with him, and the story goes on after Sloth is defeated. Arguably, the main villain, Father himself, was also used in this same way. While it took more effort than with someone like Sloth, Father essentially spent the entire story waiting in his lair for the main characters to finally come and beat him. There's nothing inherently wrong with villains being used like this, but arguably, villains who are more directly involved in the story can be a lot more interesting and a lot more threatening. In this next part of the video, I would like to highlight how well wrath and pride were used to challenge the main characters, and how them being active players in Fullmetal Alchemist's endgame really increased the stakes of the whole story. When you first look at them, both Wrath and Pride may not look particularly strong or dangerous. Wrath is an older man missing one eye, while Pride is just a kid, who looks to be the age of an elementary schooler. As you already know, however, despite their appearance, neither of these characters is even human. Pride is actually the oldest homunculus, who is only pretending to be a child, when he in reality is a being who's lived for hundreds of years. His appearance is only meant to serve as a disguise, which Pride also uses to his advantage when dealing with humans. People by nature overlook and underestimate children, and even if someone were to discover that Pride is not actually a child, having to hurt someone who looks like a kid is something that would unnerve most people. Pride in truth is however the furthest thing from a child, and is someone even the other homunculi think of as a monster. Wrath is still technically an old man, but because he is an artificial human, his strength and agility far surpasses that of what anyone his age should be able to do. Ironically, despite looking outwardly like the oldest of the group, Wrath is actually the youngest homunculus. This is very ironic, because Pride and Wrath publicly present themselves as father and son, even though Pride in reality is centuries older than Wrath. What should however also be noted is that despite his surprising youth, Wrath is by far and away stronger than most of the other homunculi. We get a hint of this long before the story's climax, where Wrath's reveal of being a homunculus is accompanied by a scene of him easily defeating one of his older siblings. What is also very interesting is that the main characters knew full well how dangerous both Wrath and Pride were, even before the start of the final battle, which is why they actually tried taking both of them out beforehand. This is where we get to the actual meat of this video, where I will do an extensive breakdown of Wrath and Pride's role in Fullmetal Alchemist's endgame, from beginning to end. Wrath, whose official role as the head of the military, starts the final act of the manga by attending a training exercise on the eve of the final battle. When he returns from the exercise, his train is stopped on a bridge, and the bridge is actually blown up. This was an attempt by the good guys to eliminate Wrath before the final battle had even started, and even though it seemingly went according to plan, Wrath actually survived this attempt on his life. Around the same time this was going on, Pride was actually moving against the main characters. One of the important plot points in Fullmetal Alchemist's ending is that Father requires 5 alchemists as sacrifices for his ritual of becoming a god. These also have to be alchemists who've tried to bring a human back to life through alchemy, which is why Ed and Al are some of the alchemists the homunculi try to capture. Because Pride needed them alive for the ritual, he ended up capturing Al before the final battle. He then uses Al's body as bait to lure Ed into also getting captured. The way Pride does this is actually very sinister. Al does not only serve as bait, but Pride uses Al's body as a human shield, to make sure that Ed and the others have to worry about not hurting Al if they fight against him. He also makes it clear that even though he needs Ed alive, that doesn't mean that he won't be able to seriously harm him, nor that he can't capture or even kill his friends. If this wasn't cold-blooded enough, one of Ed's allies is actually the homunculus Creed, who is essentially Pride's younger brother. Yet, Pride has no qualms about trying to kill him for betraying Father. This is also a sneaky bit of foreshadowing for what Pride is going to do later in this scene. Despite Pride being more powerful than Ed and his group, for a moment, they actually manage to fight back against Pride through exploiting his one weakness. Pride fights by utilizing shadows, but this also means that he cannot use any of his abilities if it is too dark or too bright. Ed actually manages to get Al's body back by exploiting this weakness, but Pride actually has another trick up his sleeve. A second homunculus, Gluttony, was at this point fighting alongside Pride, and using his strong sense of smell to find his opponents in the dark. Realizing that he was personally not suited for fighting in the dark, Pride decides on a different strategy. Without any hesitation, he decides to devour Gluttony, gaining his sense of smell in the process. With this upgrade, Pride is once again on top, and by himself manages to overpower Ed and his group. To deal with Pride, the main characters themselves also have to resort to sacrificing one of their own. They trick Pride by making Al attack him. As Al is one of the sacrifices needed for Father's ritual, Pride cannot kill him, so they use this opportunity to restrain Pride by making a huge earthen dome around him and Al, shutting off Pride's access to light, and by extension, to his powers. While this made Al also be imprisoned, it also made it so Pride was knocked out of the final battle. Without his powers, Pride was physically just a child, and Al could keep him imprisoned inside the dome as long as he wanted. This is where we get another example of how intelligent Pride is. Realizing how good-hearted and naive Al was, Pride decided to use his appearance to his advantage and started absent-mindedly tapping Al's helmet with a stick like a child. Deceived by his appearance, Al thought of this as nothing more than a kid playing with a toy. In truth, however, Pride was doing Morse code to reveal his location through the earth. It did not take long until Kimberly, one of the alchemists allied with the homunculi, showed up and freed Pride from the dome. After this, a battle ensues between Al and Pride and both of their allies. Al once again tries to trap Pride within a dome, but this proves a lot more difficult than the first time, especially due to Pride no longer finding him alone. Ultimately, Al has to retreat with his group, though they manage to mortally wound Kimberly before escaping. Pride is left at the scene with the wounded Kimberly, but rather than choosing to help his ally, Pride decides to give Kimberly the same fate as Gluttony and devours him. This moment actually tells us a lot about Pride's true character. Unlike with Gluttony, where Pride needed his sense of smell, this is an act of pure cruelty, where eating Kimberly gained Pride nothing. Kimberly was also someone who just freed Pride and had been nothing but helpful to him, which shows just how unsympathetic Pride is. He even takes joy in taunting Kimberly about what is about to happen to him, before devouring him. While Pride had been contending with Al on the outskirts of the city, the other main characters had meanwhile made a lot of gains against Father. They had managed to occupy his palace, defeat 2 of the homunculi, and were even moving towards Father himself. Everything had essentially gone according to plan, and they even literally declared that they've won. This is also the exact moment when Wrath re-enters the story. To cut back to what happened to Wrath before, while he had been inside the train when it was blown off the bridge, this was nothing someone like him couldn't overcome. On top of his physical abilities, what makes Wrath truly special as a homunculus is his left eye, which allows him to sense the environment to a superhuman degree. For Wrath, escaping the falling train through the rubble had been something perfectly within his abilities. Now that he's back to his palace, Wrath also demonstrates that even if he's completely outnumbered, he by himself is more than enough to get the job done. In one of the coolest scenes in the entire story, Wrath begins by single-handedly taking out a literal tank with just a sword and a grenade. After this, he nonchalantly enters his palace and walks over all the soldiers that try to stand up to him. These aren't also just random soldiers, but the toughest men from the entire military, where their captain even gave Ed trouble earlier in the story. Not that this is a problem for Wrath, who cuts through them like he was carving out a steak. The only reason why Wrath doesn't just kill everyone here is that the rebellious homunculus, Creed, joins the battle on the good guy's side. Creed is the homunculus whom Wrath defeated earlier in the story, and after his reincarnation, Creed wants vengeance on Wrath for all of Creed's comrades that he killed. This is another aspect that makes Wrath such a compelling villain, where he's actually harmed and killed a lot of characters throughout the story, and there's a whole line of people who have an axe to grind with him during the endgame. For Wrath though, he takes none of this too personally, and for him, it is just business as usual. Another interesting thing to note here is that unlike every other homunculus, Wrath is actually not invulnerable. He is not able to regenerate from damage, and he takes wounds just like a human. In fact, Creed himself is able to take a lot more punishment than Wrath. The true danger with Wrath is that he's simply so fast and perceptive that nobody manages to land any attacks on him, and he's able to overpower virtually everyone with just his speed and his strength. Realizing that they can't beat him conventionally, the good guys try to outmaneuver Wrath by using his blind spots and by trying to take away his weapons. This works, but only to a degree. Just like Pride, Wrath isn't just a brute, but is also very smart. Even though he loses his sword, Wrath simply finds other weapons on the battlefield to suit his needs. When they try to attack Wrath as a team, Wrath uses this against them, and for example throws his opponents at each other. These fight scenes are incredibly well done, and really show how much of a martial arts master Wrath actually is. He isn't just fighting against any opponents, but against the warriors of Jing, who specialize in fighting against the homunculi. We saw this for example earlier, where they managed to completely dominate someone like Gluttony. Wrath is however a completely different animal. In this scene, for example, Rat is doing perfectly fine fighting two people at once, even though he's lost his main weapon. Rat, however, decides to remedy this situation. He first uses one of his knives to pin Creed in place. Then, he gets to focus completely on fighting Fu, where he uses his other knife to disarm him. This, however, is not just done to weaken Fu, but Rat actually takes his weapon as his own, now once again getting to fight with a sword. Then immediately after this, Rat slashes Fu in a way where his forehead spills blood into his eyes, creating an opening for Rat to finish him off. This kind of combat is actually something that is incredibly rare in battle manga. In most manga, and even in Fullmetal Alchemist itself, the strong villains are virtually always tanks, where they take a ton of damage before being finally defeated. Whether it's Goku or Luffy, or even a more mundane character like Ippo, they very often have to land dozens upon dozens of hits on their opponents before finally winning. Rat, however, does not have this luxury of getting hit, and he's very much a glass cannon, where every wound he gets is significant. The fact that he still manages to be so threatening despite this handicap makes Rat a very special antagonist in manga. After Rat has mortally wounded him, Fu realizes that his time is up, and he decides that he is going to sacrifice himself and take Rat along with him in an explosion. Rat, however, counters this as well, cutting off the fuses from the explosives. This one moment, however, finally created a good enough blind spot, where the good guys managed to both impale Rat and take out his special eye. Even with these wounds, however, Rat still does not go down, and the battle only concludes after he takes a bullet and drops several stories into water. However, you can probably already guess that this was not enough to kill Wrath. At this point, the story is in its final volumes. Father has actually managed to personally capture 4 of the 5 necessary sacrifices he needs to complete his ritual. This is also where both Pride and Wrath return from their last battles at the same time, and their goal is to quickly make State Alchemist Mustang do a human transmutation, so that he can serve as the 5th and final sacrifice. Mustang is one of the strongest characters in the story, and he's actually taken out multiple homunculi by himself. Too bad for him though, the opponent he is facing is Wrath. Despite being already wounded, it only takes Wrath a moment to overpower Mustang and get him ready for the ritual. This really hits home how much stronger Wrath is compared to his siblings. At this point, he's lost his ultimate eye and has accumulated a lot of damage, while Mustang was at 100%, yet it literally took just 1 page for Wrath to beat Mustang. As they start doing the ritual, Wrath and Pride once again showcase their intelligence, where they know that Mustang won't do a human transmutation willingly, so Pride sacrifices another alchemist as a proxy to force Mustang to do the ritual. Fitting his trend of sacrificing his allies, Pride comes to this decision immediately and without any hesitation. Finally having all of their sacrifices, Pride goes to Father to complete their mission, while Wrath remains behind to deal with Mustang's entourage. At this point, Wrath knows that he's taken enough damage that he's already a dead man, so he decides to challenge all of the people in front of him to come at him at once. The one who, however, steps up is Scar, and Wrath's final fight in the story begins. While everything Wrath has done in the story up to this point has been to defeat Father's enemies, he tells Scar that in his final moments, he's decided to just fight for himself. This is, however, not to say that Wrath is taking the fight against Scar lightly, and in fact, he ends up giving Scar hell. This fight is another showcase of just how skilled of a fighter Wrath is, where, for example, Scar manages to break one of his swords in half, yet Wrath immediately picks the upper half of the sword in mid-air and uses it to stab and immobilize Scar's right hand. Like with Mustang, Scar was at full health when the fight started, while Wrath had taken a ton of damage and even lost his eye. Despite this, Wrath is still beating Scar in their fight. This was until Wrath was momentarily blinded by the ongoing solar eclipse, which created an opening for Scar to finally put a stop to Wrath, by literally taking out both of his arms. Even this, however, did not truly put Wrath down, and as his final act, he took one of his swords in his teeth and slashed it across Scar's body. In the end, however, Scar still lived and won, while Wrath died. finally taking the appearance of the old man his homunculus form had kept hidden. Interestingly, a number of characters actually get to see Wrath's corpse, the same characters who themselves had wanted to finish him off, and they're not only annoyed at not only having lost their chance at revenge, but at how content Wrath looks in death. While Wrath was having his final battle with Scar, Pride was busy seeing Father's plan to the end, and having his own respective final fight with Ed. The reason why Ed was all of a sudden able to put up a fight against him, even though he'd struggled so much against Pride earlier, was because forcing Mustang to do the sacrifice before had severely weakened Pride. This was to a point where Pride's body was breaking down, and he was actually trying to take over Ed's body in a desperate attempt to survive. Earlier in this video, we've already hinted quite a bit at what kind of a character Pride is. He is someone who frequently tries to mentally unnerve his opponents, as we for example see with him assuming the form of a young child, making Ed fight his own brother, or simply taunting his opponents with the horrible things he might do to them. Pride's taunting isn't however just a tactic, but something he derives sadistic pleasure from. This can be seen in him talking to Kimble when he's about to eat him, or even with Pride mocking Mustang after the human transmutation made him lose his eyesight, both of which are actions that didn't serve any purpose other than entertaining Pride. This is actually very different from someone like Wrath. When Wrath fights against his enemies, he's ironically calm about it, and he even compliments the people he's fighting. Wrath was fully aware that he was just Father's puppet, and this was something he'd completely accepted. However, Pride is the complete opposite of Wrath in this regard, and in Pride's final fight, we discover that his personality of looking down on humans was something born out of his own insecurity. When Pride tries to capture Ed's body, he ends up failing, as Kimble, who still lived on within Pride, managed to overpower his will and provide Ed with an opportunity to finish Pride off. There's quite a lot of karma in Pride's final moments. He is someone who frequently used humans' mental weaknesses against them, and even taunted them out of pure personal pleasure. Ed however used this very same thing against Pride, calling out his own insecurity of being so loyal to Father, despite Father not even truly caring for Pride. The final blow was however delivered by Kimble, where the only reason why he chose to hinder Pride was because he thought someone as proud as him should not stoop as low as trying to steal Ed's body, who was exactly the type of lowly human Pride had always looked down upon. Looking back, Wrath and Pride actually have very different endings in the story. Pride's defeat against Ed could be seen as being fairly humiliating for him, where despite being the all-powerful strongest homunculus, he's confronted with the reality that he's actually an insecure and pathetic creature. Wrath meanwhile goes out with complete dignity, fighting only for himself, and in the end saying that he had no regrets. What is however similar about their defeats is that both Wrath and Pride proved to be incredibly difficult bastards to bring down. If we look at just the manga, the climax of the story takes place mainly within the 7 final volumes. The main characters start moving against Wrath and Pride from the very start, yet they are completely relentless and keep coming back over and over again until they are finally defeated in the final few chapters. Arguably, the only role of an antagonist in a story is to make things difficult for the main characters, and Wrath and Pride perform pretty damn well in this regard. They significantly raise the stakes of the entire climax by being a constant thorn in the main character's side and repeatedly finding ways to outmaneuver them. When both of them were also finally defeated, it also had to be through a combined effort. Wrath was severely wounded before his fight with Scar, and Scar even admits that he couldn't have won otherwise. Scar himself was also left a complete wreck after the fight, and he couldn't even participate in the final battle against Father because of all of the damage he'd taken from Wrath. Pride on the other hand only became beatable through how weakened he was after forcing Mustang to do the human transmutation, and even after this, it took both Ed and Kimble to finally defeat him. And even after the final battle was over, and Wrath and Pride were finally beaten, they'd still left a lot of scars on the main characters, both literal and emotional. While I touched a bit on their characters, I really just tried to focus on the excellent role these two played as antagonists during the climax of Fullmetal Alchemist. This is something I personally didn't pay that much attention to when first going through the series, but I really do think most of the sense of danger in the endgame of the story came from these two characters, far more than with Father himself, despite him technically being the main villain. That's really it for everything I wanted to say in this video. To make it crystal clear, this is just a one-off video, and my channel is mainly about One Piece. So for the love of God, don't subscribe unless you are interested in that series. If you want to support this video though, you should click the like button since you've watched it all the way to the end. Thanks for tuning in, and take care. I had to record this afterwards because I didn't have any members when I started working on this video. Thank you to all the members who support this channel. I hope you can forgive me for making a video that wasn't about One Piece. I'll try not to make a habit of it.